Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us here on Ask the Agronomist this morning. We're almost at 7:30, so just want to make sure we had a good connection here, and want to welcome a new producer to the Ask the Agronomist stage today. I've got Mike Stewart, who's our CBA on our team, that's helping me out here this morning. So rookie producer, good luck, Mike. And we've got Jennifer and Adam via text if we need technical assistance. So hopefully things will go smoothly. And we're going to and just as a reminder, please chat in your questions. I do have some things I wanted to discuss this morning, but we will give your questions priority over what I was planning to talk about. I'm planning to dive into the exciting, fascinating, riveting world of soil testing here this morning. So if that bores you to tears, apologize. Hopefully we'll talk about some things that you find interesting. We with the current fertilizer pricing situation, we've had a lot, I would say, more questions than normal from growers about how to maximize their ROI on their fertilizer investment, how to best manage their fertilizer. And so we thought maybe this might be a good topic. And unfortunately, with things going on in the world and impacts on potash supplies and natural gas supplies and availability and pricing on things, our fertilizer situation may not improve quite as quickly as we hoped it would. So who knows what fertilizer pricing will be like this fall, but good chance it's going to be higher than you would like it to be. So you may want to continue to look for ways to maximize your investment on your fertilizer dollar. So from a soil testing standpoint, you may not do your own soil testing, and that's perfectly fine. A lot of us aren't really equipped with the technology to easy to do. So I'm not necessarily going to try to teach you all how to be soil testing technicians, because a lot of you consultants and such that are more set up to do that, probably more efficient for them to do that than it is for you to try to do it yourself. But I do think it is good to have a general understanding of the process and best practices and do's and don'ts. So from a frequency standpoint, how often should you soil test? I would generally recommend every 3 to 4 years. There are some things with keeping it in the same rotation that might make me change that frequency a little bit, because it is fairly important from a consistency standpoint to soil test the same way every time. So you should really soil test at the same time of year, following the same crop, in the same part of the field, and to the best of your ability, this is probably the most tricky thing, at the same soil moisture. So this moisture level in the soil impacts the test results, impacts the availability of the nutrients, and will actually alter the test results. And while I'm promoting soil testing and hoping that you want to soil test and hoping that you understand it's important, I will acknowledge that soil tests are not perfectly accurate. Depends on what you're testing, how accurate, what the accuracy of the test is. The most accurate test is pH. P and K would be second most accurate, and then you get into your micros, and your accuracy drops off pretty far from there. But the repeatability of soil test results is probably not as high as you would like it to be. I think most people, experts that I've talked to, would say that your P and K soil tests are about 60% accurate or repeatable. pH would be probably more like 75% plus. That is the most accurate. So they are not the gospel, but they are the best guide that we have to what's in the soil. If you like to do tissue testing and refine things more, it is truly most important to know what's in the plant, not what's in the soil. And knowing what's in the soil doesn't necessarily tell you what's available to the plant. So there are situations where you might want to pair up tissue testing with your soil testing. There's a lot of different ways you can manage it. There's a lot of different strategies. There's a lot of different philosophies. And depending on, who you're working with, you may get a different philosophy than what I share with you here today. So there isn't just one way to soil test, but I do think that doing it at the same time of the year, doing it in the same crop or following the same crop, and trying to do it, at a relatively constant soil moisture level are good things to keep in mind.
Hey, Lance,
Yes.
we have a question from
Awesome.
the group. You touched on a little bit of
Yep.
it, but really Merrill is interested in your thoughts on spring versus fall soil testing.
Yep. No, great question. And I'll answer it this way. I actually don't prefer either of those. I'm more of an early summer guy. So what I have moved to on my farm is a early June testing, and I test in soybeans. So in soybeans in early June, you can still run around the field on a four-wheeler and get through the field without doing a lot of damage. And typically in that late May, early June timeframe each year, we probably have decent soil moisture. Hopefully it's not a sloppy mess. If it's really wet, you're not going to be out there anyway. It's probably not going to be super dry. And I think that early summer time frame, you probably have more consistent soil moisture than you do spring or fall, because in the fall, sometimes it's bone dry, sometimes it's mud. Same, in the spring, it's generally not bone dry. I don't think it really matters that much when you test. But I do think you should try to do it at the same time every year. So once you decide what your favorite time is, another advantage of the time I'm doing it is nobody else is doing it then, or very few people are. So there's not much of a wait at the lab. Sometimes if you're doing it in the fall, when that's kind of the typical time to soil test, sometimes the labs are busy, the technicians are busy. So sometimes it's a little harder to get people if you're soil testing the same time everybody else is. But I don't really think it's honestly that important. It does change the results of the test based on when you do it. So you don't want to be jumping around from different times of the year, because that will change the test or change the results of the test and make you think your soil fertility has changed when it really hasn't. So I would say pick a time that's convenient for you, that's convenient for whoever's doing your soil testing. Talk with your retailer, talk with whoever's doing the soil testing, see if there's a time that they prefer, see if there's a time that they think their test is more accurate, see if there's a time that, it's a slow time for them. They would appreciate having something to do at that time of year. But whatever you decide to do, stick with it, is I think what I would recommend. So going on down through my list of things I wanted to touch on is so how about how do you pull those tests? So I was going to bring my soil probe with me just to show you. My soil probe's actually got a little hash mark right on the probe at about a 7-inch depth. So 6 2/3 inches deep. Actually, this is a little trivia for you here this morning on Ask the Agronomist. 6 2/3 inches deep is considered an acre furrow slice, and 6 2/3 of an inch deep across an acre weighs about 2 million pounds worth of soil. So I doubt if anybody's ever tested that to prove that, but we generally consider that plow depth, 6 2/3, 7 inches across an acre, to be 2 million pounds of soil. So that's why, if you've ever wondered, if somebody's ever told you if you've got parts per million soil test, take it times 2 to convert to pounds per acre soil test. That's why, because there's 2 million pounds of soil roughly in that 6 2/3 inch depth that we're sampling. And we'll talk more about parts per million or pounds per acre, because that's one of the first things that you want to look at on your report, because some labs print or report parts per million, some labs report pounds per acre. Some labs will give you an option which way you'd rather look at it. I think in pounds better than I think in parts per million. So I prefer to see pounds, because that's just the way my head works. It's the same result either way. You just have to do a simple conversion to go from one to the other. So, most of the time, it's very important, I think, to do GPS soil testing. Now, what size grid you want to do, whether you want to do zones or grids, that's all arguable. People have different opinions, but it is very important to get back to the same part of the field every time you test. And honestly, it would probably drive you crazy if this is 1 square foot of soil here, and you pull a core from here, 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 and here in 1 square foot of soil, and you analyzed each core separately, it would blow your mind how different the data would be coming out of those 5 cores. We're going to mix those all together into one composite sample. And then the next time you come back and soil test, you're probably not going to get exactly in the same spot again, but hopefully you get close. You want to try to get back as close to that same spot as you can. But the variability of nutrients in soils is tremendous. If you analyze the same core 3 different times at the same lab with the same method, you're going to get 3 different numbers. If your P1 that first time comes out at 60, you're not going to get 60 all 3 times you rerun that same sample. So that's what I'm talking about with soil testing being it's science, but it's science with some art, and it's a guide. It's not the gospel. They're not perfect, but they're a whole lot better than just guessing or not having anything to go off of at all. But the important part of the GPS is to get back to the same part of the field each time. Whether you want to test on grids, just set the field up into simple grids. That's the way most of it's done. What I would say is, 2.5 acre grids are probably kind of the standard for GPS soil testing. Some people will stretch that up to 3.3 just to get the cost down a little bit. I wouldn't go any higher than 5 acre grids. It's probably not necessary to go any lower than 2.5. The smaller the grid size, the more accurate your tests are going to be, the better your map's going to be, the more precise and perfect you get, but also the more expensive that you get for the soil testing. So I do 2.5 acre grids at home. I think that's probably the most common, but you can tweak that a little bit higher if you want to save a few bucks in your soil testing. I personally think the money you spend on soil tests is insignificant compared to the money you spend on fertilizer. So to me, not soil testing because it's too expensive, or doing a poor job soil testing because you're trying to cheapen it up is a little bit silly, because you could be wasting way more money on fertilizer because you've got poor soil tests than you save by doing poor soil testing instead of good soil testing. So I think it's money well spent, and I would get good tests. I'd have small enough grid that you know what you're dealing with. The zone concept. So I've got a field set up here and kind of some theoretical zones. What some people will do is they'll identify zones in a field. So let's say these zones could be soil type. The zones could be soil texture. The zones could be, soil electrical conductivity. You can create zones, lots of different ways in a field. And then what some people will do is they'll come in and grid within a zone. And so each zone, they'll create their own grid in, and then they'll manage these zones by zones rather than across the field. There's nothing wrong with that. If that's the method that your soil testing company prefers, that's perfectly fine. I think you can accomplish the same thing with a 2.5 acre grid across the whole field, but there are arguments that can be made that working within zones might, improve the accuracy a little bit. Whether it improves it enough to be, real impactful or not, I think that's a point that can be argued. We talked about time of year. We talked about crop rotation. So the lab. So it's also important to, almost all accredited soil testing labs. There could be some non-accredited people out there doing soil testing, but any accredited lab, has standards that they have to meet. You can ask for their accreditation. You can talk to their people and make sure that you're comfortable that it's a good soil testing lab. All the soil testing labs I've ever worked with personally, they're very professional. They do a good job. I'm not going to recommend one over the other, but I do think it is important that you use the same lab each time you soil test as best you can. If you change suppliers or the lab sells, or sometimes you have to change, but every lab is a little different, and your consistency of those test results are going to be the best if you stay with the same lab. So I would not be jumping around from one lab to another each time you soil test. So just keep that in mind. The extraction method that they're using needs to stay constant as well. So just be aware there are different extraction methods. There are different soil test methods that can be used by different labs. Some labs have a preference for one over the other. Maybe they think it's more accurate. Maybe it's more set up. Maybe the way their equipment's set up. You want to be using the same extraction method and the same lab. If you're going to compare soil test this time versus soil test 4 years ago. If you're not making those comparisons back in history to your old soil test, it doesn't really matter per se if you're just looking for the soil test to show you differences across the field. But I think what most people like to do is they like to see over time, are they making progress on the changes they want to make in their fertility? And if you want to be able to do that, then you need to be consistent with the lab. You need to be consistent with the soil test to make sure you're not making apples to oranges comparisons. And I would say this too, kind of related to that. If you see a drastic difference in soil tests from one testing cycle to the other, so let's say 4 years ago, your K test was 400 and now it's 200, that's either an error or some artificial thing making that happen. You could not have mined 200 pounds per acre of potassium out of your field in 4 years, no matter what your yield was and no matter how little fertilizer you put on. So if you see drastic changes from one cycle to the next, that's probably something else that's causing that change. Now, you don't really know. So if it was 400 4 years ago and it's 200 now, they may have both been wrong, and maybe it's been 300 for the last 4 years. And 4 years ago, it was 100 high, and now it's 100 low. And that can happen with, differences and, slight differences in sample depth can really skew the results too. So everything is calibrated based on that 6 2/3 inches sample depth. If you've got somebody that's being sloppy and this one they pull at 4 inches and this one they pull at 9, that's going to change that dramatically because your fertility goes down as you go deeper in the soil. We apply most of our fertility near the surface, and even if you're doing tillage, your nutrient concentration is probably greatest at the surface, and then it drops as you go down. And so the deeper you test, the lower your test results are going to be. And the shallower you test, especially if you're a no-tiller like me and you're making almost all surface applications and you've got a lot of stratification of nutrients, if you get a little sloppy when you're pulling your test and you're occasionally pulling one 4 or 5 inches deep instead of 7, that might throw your test off 200 pounds to the acre. It can change it dramatically. So being consistent with your depth is very important as well. So we'll get into a little more of the details of what we should be testing for. And, part of that goes back to the accuracy of the test. So some of the micros, the test results are just not very accurate, not very repeatable. And some nutrients are so variable in the soil. So nitrogen, for example, there are soil tests for nitrogen. You can do soil nitrate testing if you want to fine tune your nitrogen program, but there's really no reason to test for nitrogen levels in your soil as part of your standard soil fertility testing, protocol, because nitrogen comes and goes. It moves in the soil. It's here one day, it's gone next week. You can't hold nitrogen in your soil. So there's really no reason when you're doing your basic soil testing to be testing for nitrate or ammonium or spending money on, if it's part of the standard test that you're getting and you're not paying extra for it, fine, but you don't need to be paying extra money to test for nitrogen. Sulfur is another nutrient that is very mobile in the soil, and a lot of soil tests report sulfur, and that's fine, but we're not really building sulfur in soil. So I manage sulfur the same way I manage nitrogen. Every crop needs sulfur every year. You need to put sulfur on every year. If you use elemental sulfur and you use a lot of it, you can look like you're building your soil sulfur level because there's always a little bit of elemental that's being released. But we'll talk about cation exchange capacity here in a minute. The soil can only hold positively charged ions. The soil is negatively charged. If a nutrient is a negatively charged ion in the soil in its natural state, like nitrate, sulfate, those are negatively charged molecules in the soil. A negative can't hold a negative. So I don't care, how amazing your soil is. It can't hold nitrate. It can't hold sulfate. And eventually, that's the kind of the final state of all those nutrients in the soil, is they're going to be in a sulfate or nitrate form, and they're going to be leachable. They're going to be movable, and for that reason, I don't care as much to see what those levels are on a soil test. Did you have a question, Mike?
One of the things that you might want to talk about too is if they do want to do sulfate and nitrate testing, it's not typically done in a 6-inch probe. I mean, you're talking a drill bit.
Right. Yeah. So, and Mike's point was, if you do want to test for nitrate or sulfate, those are different tests because the nutrient is more mobile in the soil. So typically you're testing the top foot, and in the case of nitrate, sometimes even the second foot. So, it's hard to, 12 inches is not an easy soil probe to get. The second 12 inches is a real bear. You got to have some kind of specialized equipment to get that 12 to 24 inch core. But if you are really closely following the protocol on a soil nitrate test, it is a totally different test. You got to handle the samples a lot differently. It's a more expensive test. It's a more labor intensive test. That's the reason most people don't do it, because it is more challenging and more difficult. And again, all this testing, I don't care how much money you spend on it. I don't care how good the lab is. I don't care how often you do it. I don't care how small a grid you're willing to do it on. It's not going to be perfect. There's still a lot of art in this. So basically, what you want to look for on a soil test, and we talked about this already. First thing you want to look for is it parts per million or pounds per acre. And remember that if it is parts per million, it's going to be a lower number, and you take parts per million times 2 to equal pounds per acre. So it doesn't matter which one you're using, you just got to remember that little formula. And the next thing you want to look for on your soil test, you want to look for the date. So, you pull out a soil test, if the date on it is, November 10th, 2014, means it's time to re-soil test. So you want to make sure that test is new enough that it's still relevant. Every 4 years is what I do on my farm, assuming that you're doing, standard rotation. So if year 4 is coming up and you've done something funky in your rotation, maybe you had a couple of years of corn or maybe 3 years of corn, and it's been 4 years, and the last time you soil tested, you were soil testing following soybeans. Let's say you tested in the fall. You were soil testing following soybeans. If 4 years rolls around and you'd be following corn, then you should back up and do it on the 3rd year or let it go to the 5th year. I think it's more important to be following the same crop every time you test than it is to stick to the 4 years cycle religiously. Now, if you can anticipate that in year 4 you're going to be off cycle, and you catch that soon enough that you could sample in year 3 rather than stretching it to 5, that would be preferable. But if you don't catch that until you're already in year 4 and you realize, oh crap, I'm following a different crop, then I'd probably rather get off cycle and wait a year on that so I could be following the same crop. So every soil test you get is going to have some basic stuff. If you get a soil test report that doesn't have this, you need to look for a new lab. So you're going to get pH. You will probably also get something called buffer pH. We'll talk about the difference of that. You'll get organic matter. You'll get CEC. You'll get phosphorus, potassium, and generally magnesium and calcium. So that's pretty basic there. So There's no micros, there's no base saturation in that. I want more than this, but this will be on every soil test. So the difference between pH and buffer pH. Buffer pH is going to be a higher number than pH, and you need to lime based on your pH level, not the buffer pH level. Now, you can use either one. There are some states, I think Nebraska uses buffer pH. You can use buffer pH to figure out what your liming requirement is, but you got to make sure that, the formula that you're using to figure up your liming requirement is designed to use buffer pH and not standard pH. I use standard pH. What the buffer pH tells me is it does give you some information on how much lime is that soil going to require to get you up to where you want to be. And we'll talk about where you want to be here in a minute. But that's the difference between pH and buffer pH. The buffer pH is telling you how strongly that soil is buffered. And the more strongly the soil is buffered, the more lime it takes to move it up as you're trying to adjust pH. Organic matter, pretty self-sufficient. That's just the percent organic matter of your soil. CEC. So CEC stands for the cation exchange complex. That is the negatively charged part of the soil that holds on to the cations. So the cations are the positively charged. CEC impacts a lot of things in your soil, and it's a pretty important piece of soil chemistry, pretty important piece of soil testing, pretty important piece of nutrient management, and a good thing to have on a soil test. P and K obviously is pretty explanatory. Magnesium and calcium, same thing. We don't really apply. Well, we do apply magnesium and calcium as lime. We don't apply magnesium and calcium typically because we need more magnesium and calcium. You're applying lime to adjust the pH, but at the same time, that's applying magnesium and calcium to the soil. And you do run into people that get into low mag lime, doing things with trying to get the calcium level up relative to the magnesium level. There are soils that probably have a lot more magnesium than they maybe would prefer to have, and you can get calcitic lime that has low levels of magnesium. Producer Mike's back there doing that because it's expensive. Sometimes you got to truck it a long ways. I don't spend a lot of time worrying about that myself. pH is very important to me. Your ratio of magnesium to calcium is not that important to me. I want to focus on pH. And while we're on the subject of pH, here's the reason that I like to start with pH. So the pH of the soil varies a lot less than the P and K levels across the field. The pH of the field is more uniform than the P and K levels in the field. The soil test for pH is more accurate than the soil test for P and K. And the pH of the field has a lot to do with nutrient availability in your field. So if your pH is out of whack, that's the first place I like to start. Now, lime is not very sexy compared to fertilizer. There are, retail dealers that don't even apply lime. So sometimes you got to go to a different contractor to get your lime applied. There's not a lot of money in lime for anybody. It's not something that people get excited about doing, but frankly, it's to me the most important part of your soil fertility program because it's where everything starts. And if you've got a soil that's got a pH of 5.8, before I put any DAP or potash on that field, I want to try to get to work on that lime. Now, if your pH is really low and it's going to take 6 tons of lime to get it up to where you want to get it to, which for me, where I would like to see it's probably in the 6.3, 6.4 range. There's not necessarily a benefit to being over 6.5. Being much over 7 is kind of a negative. So you want to be somewhere in the mid 6s is the ideal place to be. If you're growing only corn, you can let it dip a little lower. Soybeans typically are going to prefer a little bit higher pH, as does any legume. If you've got alfalfa in a rotation, then you want your pH even higher. But your legumes typically need a closer to a basic pH, which would be up close to 7. Corn is fine, a little on the acidic side. So, 6 or 6.1, 6.2 is probably about perfect for corn. But if you're in a corn bean rotation, typically I'm going to try to get you up more like 6.4, 6.5 to, be kind of in the sweet spot for both crops. But, if your soil needs a lot of lime to get that pH adjusted, you don't want to just go puking on 6 ton of lime in one year. 2.5 or 3 ton at a time is probably the most that I would do. And just be aware that if you do put on a lot of lime and you're not doing tillage to incorporate that lime, you're going to get a really high pH zone right on the surface of your soil, which can occasionally cause some wonky things to happen. I'm a pretty devout no-tiller myself, so I do surface apply lime and count on macropores and root channels and earthworms and natural cycling of the soil to get that lime, moved to where it needs to be. I'm sure I've got pH stratification big time in my soil, but I don't really see, any long-term issues in long-term no-till fields just because lime didn't get incorporated. You will still run into people that think that lime has to be incorporated, and it probably does work better that way. So, if you do want to, and sometimes if you talk to people that, are getting into no-till, they will say, get your pH right before you start on no-till. Because if you got a low pH and you're trying to no-till and you're trying to adjust your pH, a little bit of tillage might not be a bad thing if you're trying to get the pH of the soil adjusted. So watch your pH. That's number one thing. pH can affect availability of other nutrients. It can affect the efficacy of herbicides. It can impact, lots of things in the soil biology and the soil chemistry. And it's just a good place to start. And even though lime seems expensive, it's a lot cheaper to me than most of the other nutrients. And so it's just a good place to start. So after pH,
before we pivot off of it to the next one, we had a question come in about how reliable is the sulfur and the sulfur test, which you touched on briefly, but go a little deeper into that.
So the sulfur soil test reliability is, but the amount of sulfur in the soil can vary so much from one day to the next and 1 week to the next and one part of the field to the next. I don't personally worry too much about testing for sulfur in soil, just because it's a lot like testing for nitrogen. Just because there's sulfur in your soil the day you test doesn't necessarily mean there's going to be enough there for the crop. So, you're generally going to have more sulfur in your high organic matter soils. So if you test a 4% organic matter soil and you test a 2% organic matter soil and you haven't been using sulfur, there's going to be more sulfur in that 4% organic matter soil because it's being mineralized out of the organic matter. So I'm not trying to, diss on the accuracy of the sulfur soil test. But it is a very variable nutrient in the soil. And I don't see a lot of value in a sulfur soil test just because it doesn't really tell you anything about how much sulfur is going to be there 2 months later after you take the soil test. So hopefully that addresses the question. You will get sulfur on a lot of standard soil tests. And if it comes on the test, I might look at the number, but I'm not going to not apply sulfur because for some reason I have a high soil sulfur test because the soil can't hold it. So even if there was a lot there the day that you tested, that doesn't necessarily mean that you, and in my opinion, that does not mean at all that you don't need to apply sulfur. So if you've used a lot of elemental sulfur over the years, you will get a higher soil test reading because that elemental sulfur is breaking down slowly over time. If you've used a lot of manure, you'll have a higher sulfur soil test level. And there could be some scenarios if you've been putting on 40 pounds of elemental sulfur, every year for 5 years, yeah, you could probably skip a year. If you've put on 8,000 gallon of hog manure, you probably don't need to apply sulfur. So there could be some unique situations where there would be an adequate amount of sulfur in the soil, and that soil test is probably going to reflect a higher sulfur level in those scenarios. So appreciate the questions. Keep them coming. So let's talk about our P and K, or well, let's back up. Let's talk about CEC. So CEC should be on every soil test. What is not on a lot of soil tests, and this is kind of a pet peeve of mine, is something called base saturation. Base saturation refers or kind of relates to CEC, and it involves the cation nutrients. So potassium, calcium, hydrogen, and what am I missing, Mike? Whatever. Forget my other one. Magnesium.
Yeah, magnesium.
Okay. So these are all positively charged in the soil. So the ones here the one that we're most concerned about is potassium. And if you've had a soil test, let's say you've got a field that's got a K test of 375, which ought to be plenty in most soils, but you see potassium deficiency frequently, and you think, well, I got plenty of potassium in that soil. Why am I seeing potassium deficiency? Look at your base saturation and see if your base saturation is under 3%. So I would like to see 3% potassium base saturation. You can't get there on every soil. The lighter soils, you will have a higher base saturation than you will on heavy soils. So CEC on most soils in Illinois is going to range from, say, less than 5 on a sand to over 25 on a high organic matter, high clay soil. So your CEC is driven by your organic matter level and your clay content level primarily, which is driven primarily by soil type. You will not in your lifetime significantly change the CEC of your soil unless you do something that dramatically increases the organic matter level. If you do something that increases your organic matter level, you should also see an increase in your CEC. But it's not going to change much. If you got light timber soils with a CEC of 8 to 11, which I farm a lot of those, that's the way they're always going to be. If you're farming, Ep5 4.5% organic matter with CEC of 27, good for you. That's the way it's always going to be. It's just the nature of the soil. So those high CEC soils can hold a lot of potassium. And those high CEC soils can tie up a lot of potassium. And what the base saturation is telling you is how much plant available potassium do you have? Because if it's not on the exchange site, it's not very readily available to the plant. The stuff that's held by the exchange site is held loosely. It can come and go off of that exchange site. It's in an equilibrium in the soil solution, and the nutrients that the plants are going to pick up are coming off of those what's held on the exchange site. And the higher your base saturation, the more plant available potassium you're going to have in that soil, and the easier it would be for that plant to take that potassium, away from the soil, basically. Calcium is going to be correlated pretty heavily to pH. So your high pH soils, you're going to have a lot of calcium on the exchange site. If you've got high mag levels in your soil, you'll have a lot of magnesium on the exchange site. And if you've got low pH, hydrogen is a measure of acidity in the soil. So if you've got a pH of 5.5, you're going to have a lot of hydrogen on that exchange complex. And hydrogen is doing you no good on the exchange complex. So if you can get that pH up, that's going to kick off hydrogen. And maybe it'll make a little more room to get some more potassium or something that's going to do you some good on there. So that's what base saturation does for you. It's most important nutritionally to potassium, And I really want base saturation on a soil test because I want to know what my base saturation of potassium is. And I'm going to adjust what I say my pounds per acre need to be based off of what the base saturation is. So if you can get to and if you're farming a light soil, there are occasionally benefits of farming light soil. Light soils are easier to lime, and light soils have more available, it's easier to build potassium in that soil. Now that's a little bit of some people would probably be screaming at me right now because high CEC soils, high organic matter soils, dark soils can hold more potassium than light soil can. So we don't necessarily recommend building your light soils to as high a level of potassium because the soil can't hold it and it's just going to leach out and you're wasting money on potassium the soil can't hold. The reason it can't hold it is because it's got a weaker cation exchange complex, and that means that it's easier for the plant to find it and get it. So if you've got a soil that has let's say you've got a K test of let's say your test comes back at 240. 240 is kind of low. I don't want to see 240 on my soil test. But if at 240, your base saturation is 4%, that might be fine because you've got a lot of potassium available to the plants with a 4% base saturation. Now, the cation exchange complex is, the capacity of it to hold is smaller in this field. So this field's probably got a CEC of like 10. So even though you got 4%, if you got a CEC of 10, 4% is not a lot. So you probably still want to build that K test level above this. But on the flip side, what happens in some soils is you might have a 400 K test and your base saturation is 2.3 and your CEC is 27. I'm going to say you don't have enough potassium in that field because there's not, enough on that exchange complex. And maybe maybe the hydrogen's too high. Maybe the magnesium's too high. Maybe the calcium's too high. Something else is occupying the other thing. They'll always add up to 100%. So your exchange, the total of the 4 base saturations is going to add up to 100%. And as one goes down, another one's going to go up. And that balance between those things. Some people like to spend a lot of time talking about ratios and balancing nutrients. I personally want to have enough of everything there. If the ratio is not quite what somebody says it ought to be, I don't worry as much about the ratio as I do just do you have enough of everything there. But there are situations where if you've got an obscene amount of something, that may be reducing the availability of something else. And so that's why some people like to talk about ratios. But that's why I want to see a base saturation. I want to look at not just the pounds, not just the base saturation, not just the CEC. I want to look at the whole thing. And what's your plant telling you? So maybe this is a place to do some tissue testing. Maybe this is a place to scout your fields. Are you typically seeing potassium deficiency in your corn sometime during the growing season every year? If you are, I want to be looking at that base saturation. I want to be looking at those K soil tests. Just because you put potash on every 2 years, and just because your soil test says that you've got 300 pounds of potash or potassium in your soil, that doesn't necessarily mean the plant's getting all of it at once. So the plant will tell you if it's getting all at once based on either a tissue test or visual symptomology on the plant. And you really shouldn't be seeing potassium deficiency routinely in your corn. If you are, I think there's room for improvement in your potassium management. So going on down the list here, we'll talk about the micros a little bit. So the next things that you would most likely see on a soil test report, and I'm going to put sulfur here, even though that's not a micro. Boron, zinc, iron, copper, aluminum, and sodium. So those after NPK, calcium, and magnesium. Question, comment?
Manganese.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, manganese.
Manganese.
Forgot manganese. After your PK, calcium, magnesium, don't get magnesium and manganese confused. Those are hard words to say sometimes. These are the things you're most likely to see next. I don't worry too much about any of these on a soil test. Manganese can be important in some parts of the country. It's not particularly important around here because our soils are typically not terribly deficient in manganese. But in some parts of places in Indiana, some parts of the country, manganese is a very important nutrient. The accuracy of the soil test on these nutrients is not good. The availability of these nutrients is sometimes not good. Just because it's in the soil doesn't mean the plant's getting what it needs. If you want to test for these nutrients, probably a tissue test to figure out what's in the plant would be the best thing to do. I'm not saying that the soil test data is worthless, but it's not as valuable with these nutrients to me. So if your lab does micros, and some of them do micros as kind of a selling point that, hey, if you do your soil testing with us, we're going to get you micros and we're not going to charge you any extra for it. I'll take it if you want to give it to me, but I'm not going to pay an extra $5 an acre for my soil testing to get micros. If you want to spend money on micros, I would say it would be better off to spend money on tissue testing to see where you're at for micros than it would be to get them in the soil test. So we could, so that's kind of what I wanted to cover on, what to look for on a soil test, what you need on a soil test. Now you kind of get to the, where you get to the important part is, well, now what? So I've got these soil tests. I've got all this information. What in the world do I do with all this? How do you decide what to apply? And that gets into, lots of different opinions and people have different philosophies on that. Do you do VRT spreading? If you're doing GPS grid soil sampling and you're looking at yield removal, then you're going to want to be doing variable rate spreading. When VRT first started, I think people thought that they would raise the low parts of the field and bring the high parts of the field down, and after doing it for 10 or 15 years, it'd all be the same. And if that was ever your philosophy or your hope or your goal with VRT fertilizer applications, you're probably somewhat disillusioned because your field really never got even. It never got more uniform. There's still a lot of variability across the field. So I'm a big believer in VRT applications, but I'm not doing it because I'm trying to make the field all the same. It may get more uniform over time, but there's always going to be variability out there that we're going to have to manage. But I do think that it does make sense to variably apply nutrients based on a soil test, but for me, more based on crop removal. So when I make a script on our farm, I'm looking at the soil test, I'm looking at the crop removal, so I'm looking at the yield, and then you kind of mesh those two together. And if you've got parts of your field that, if you've got sky high soil test and your soil test says you don't need fertilizer, and that part of the field has an average yield, as long as you're confident that the yield is not average because there's a problem with the soil test, then, you probably don't need fertilizer on that part of the field. If you've got another part of the field that you've got low soil tests and poor yields, you need to make sure that there's not a correlation between those two. So is the yield poor because the soil test's low? Well, if it is, then you really need to address the soil fertility in that part of the field. If the yield is poor because of the soil type, so maybe it's a sandy spot, and there's not a lot of nutrition there because it's a sand, but no matter how much nutrition's there, it's still going to be a poor yielding spot because it's sandy. You may not need a lot of fertilizer there either. And then you may find a part of the field where you've got low soil test levels and super high yields. And there's a lot of acres out there like this because, and the reason the soil test is low here is because we're never putting enough fertilizer on there to keep up with the yield. So let's say you're fertilizing for 250 bushel corn. Most of you aren't, but let's say you are. And let's say this spot here often yields 300 in a good year. So every time you put on 250 bushel worth of fertilizer and you yield 300 bushel corn, you're mining that soil in that part of the field. So what happens over a lifetime is we mine the high yielding parts of the field. And I would argue that the high yielding parts of your field might be where you should be putting on more fertilizer than the low yielding parts of your field. And I think it's a little bit, maybe a little bit old school thinking that we used to think that, well, I need more fertilizer to make that low yielding spot better. Well, that low yielding spot's probably low yielding for some reason other than fertilizer. And fertilizer is probably not going to fix it. And your high yielding spot, even though it's been high yielding every year, even though it's always the best part of the field, you've probably been under fertilizing that spot forever. And you probably don't really know how good it could be if it had the fertility that it was really looking for. So you get into a little bit of different philosophy, and people will have different opinions on that. But we have a saying that we talk a lot about. You feed the faster horses, and if you've got a fast horse part of your field, have you been feeding it enough to get the maximum amount of yield out of that part of the field? So we can talk about buildup versus removal a little bit. So buildup would be trying to get your soil test levels to where they want to be. Buildup is expensive. Even when fertilizer is cheap, buildup is expensive because the soil holds a lot of nutrient. So it takes 9 pounds of P2O5 and it takes 4 pounds of K2O. So this would be phosphorus. This would be potassium. Takes 9 pounds of fertilizer to increase your soil test 1 pound with phosphorus. Takes 4 pounds of potassium to increase your soil test level 1 pound. So this is the reason why I said earlier that if you see a dramatic change in your soil test, it's probably not, in a short period of time, it's not because you've mined all the nutrients out of the soil, because it works the same way in reverse. You'd have to remove 9 pounds of nutrient to lower your soil test one pound as well. So the soil test values, if they're accurate, are going to go up slow and they're going to come down slow based on fertilizer application or removal. If they're jumping 50 or 100 pounds from one soil test to the next, that's not due to removal or fertilizer practices. That's due to either field variability, sample variability, some sort of error in the testing. And again, you don't know, so let's say you get two numbers that are vastly different. You don't really know which one's closer to right. You hope the high one's the right one and the low one's the wrong one, but it may not be that way. So just something to keep in mind. And then how often and when do we apply? So I like to apply fertilizer every year. Kind of the old standard was a 2-year spread. We'd put on 2 years worth of fertilizer, typically ahead of corn. We were guessing at what the corn was going to yield. We were guessing what the beans were going to yield. We would probably guess low because that would cheapen up our fertilizer program. You'd put on 2 years worth of fertilizer. The corn would yield better than you anticipated. It would use 80% of what you applied, and then the beans would just have to get by with whatever's left. And that's still the way a lot of people manage their fertilizer. I would prefer to spread every year because you can be more precise with it. If you're going to do removal rate spreading, I'm working a year behind on our farm. So in a lot of cases, people are applying fertilizer in the fall, thinking about next year's crop. And like I said, the kind of the old standard was you're thinking about the next 2 years worth of crop. So this certainly works as long as you're putting on enough. I'm going to say it doesn't really matter how you're doing it. I apply in the fall, looking back at this year's crop. So I look at my soil test, but I look mostly at the yield that I just produced. And if you know that this corn in this part of the field made 273, you can put on the nutrition that 273 bushel corn just removed, and you can just hit it right dead on. You're not guessing at what next year's yield is going to be. So I don't use a yield goal to develop my fertilizer rec. I use yield data to develop my fertilizer rec, and I work 1 year behind. So it's just a different way to do it. As long as you're putting on enough nutrition, it doesn't really matter that much which way you do it. I think it's a little easier to manage if you're working in reverse like I do, rather than looking forward and guessing. But either way will work. We're trying to apply fewer nutrients, or trying to apply no nutrients on frozen ground these days. So just be aware that we used to put a lot of fertilizer on in the dead of winter when things were froze. You get a bad rain at the wrong time on frozen ground or partially frozen ground. There's the fertilizer going lots of places we don't want fertilizer to go. So try to do your applications in the fall before we freeze up, or if you can't get those done, wait till spring on those applications. Try not to do anything on frozen ground in the winter. It's just a better way to manage your nutrition. We can talk about maybe in a future episode about surface versus subsurface applications and banding or incorporation versus non-incorporating. There is some data out there that shows that nutrients left on the surface, even if they're not going on frozen ground, sometimes bad things happen to those nutrients. And if you can get them into the soil, that's a better place for them to be. So maybe you do that by a band. Maybe you do that by some shallow incorporation. Even a vertical tillage pass. If you're gonna vertical till all your corn stalks ahead of beans anyway, I'd sure like to have my dry on in the fall before I run my vertical till across. You're just going to incorporate that fertilizer, and you're better off driving on the field before you do that vertical till pass than you are after anyway. So if you're going to do a little bit of tillage, try to get your fertilizer work done first, so that you can incorporate that fertilizer a little bit. So we're coming up right here on the end. I've got more stuff we could go through. Mike told me we wouldn't get through the whole list today. So if there's interest in particular topics we discussed, or you'd like to hear more, or you'd like us to dive deeper into certain things, or you'd like us to shut the hell up and quit talking about fertility because you're bored to death, let us know. So I see a question there. What you got?
There is a great question here from John. He says, for leachable nutrients like sulfur and boron, thoughts on application timing, target rates, and an annual basis.
Yep. Okay. So great question, John. Appreciate that. And yes, I do like annual applications for all of those nutrients. Timing wise, I think fall's fine. I think spring is fine. I wouldn't probably be trying to use a lot of those, nutrients in season, because you're probably not going to have them available to the crop if you're putting them on too late in the season. Some of those nutrients get recommended foliarly as well. So a lot of guys like to do a little bit of foliar boron. You can't get, in my opinion, even with micros, you can't get enough micro in that plant foliarly. You need it in the soil too. So the plant feeds itself primarily through the roots. Doesn't mean that you can't get some nutrition in the plant foliarly, but the plant feeds itself primarily through the roots. So if you're going to feed the plant, you need to feed the soil. So I like to get those nutrients on. If you're banding in the fall, like strip till, I've always got those nutrients in my strip. If you're doing starter with your planter, that's a great way to get those products on. If you're making a spring, broadcast application, maybe you can get it in there. It's hard to get it all perfect. When you're looking at, you're applying P, K, and sulfur and zinc and boron, let's say, in a dry spread, and you were looking at your soil test, you're looking at your yield removal, and you're looking at your map, and you get it all perfect. Well, I want about 20 to 25 units of sulfur across every acre. I don't want to variable rate my sulfur. I want the sulfur to be flat rated. Well, you can't vary this one and flat that one unless you got a spreader truck that's got 3+ bins in it that keeps everything separate. That equipment's out there, but it's not very available. It's expensive. It's hard to maintain. It's a pain in the butt. So a lot of guys have maybe a single or a dual bin spreader. I have had some fields that I've driven across twice just because I'm being real particular about the way I want something done. But at some point, you reach a point of diminishing returns there where you're actually economically better off to not manage it so precisely, because the cost of being perfect probably exceeds the value of being perfect at some point. So on the nutrients, each nutrient has a different need. And what I like to do, John, is I like to look at what's a 250 bushel corn crop going to remove. And I don't have them all off the top of my head, but you can look up what is the zinc content of 250 bushels of grain. What is the boron content of 250 bushels of grain? And then I want to apply more than that, because the plant is going to take up a lot more than leaves the field in the grain. But at a bare minimum, we need to be putting on what the grain is going to remove. And then because of some lost efficiency and things, we need to do more than that. So sulfur is the one that I know off the top of my head. I want at least 20 pounds of sulfur annually in corn, and at least 15 pounds of sulfur. And when I say, I mean units of nutrient, not pounds of product. So 15 units of elemental salt, not of the element sulfur. I don't mean elemental fertilizer sulfur. And then in corn, at least 20 units of sulfur, for that crop. How you get that product on and when you get it on. If you're using sulfur, like sulfate sulfur forms, fall applications are a little sketchy, because you just don't know how much of that's still going to be there for the crop. If you're applying in the spring, elemental is not the best, because it may not be readily available at the right time. So generally speaking, with sulfur, if you're doing it in the fall, probably needs to be at least a portion of it as elemental, so that you don't lose it too quickly. If you're doing it in the spring, I'd like it to be all sulfate. So a mixture of two different forms would be the best. Hard to be perfect, but just things to keep in mind. So great question. That takes us to the end here. So appreciate all the questions today. Hopefully you enjoyed the what I called soil testing 201 conversation here, and we can go different bunny trails and the fertility thing, and if fertility is something that you'd like to dive into deeper in future episodes, send me an email, send me a text, let somebody know what you're interested in. As always, appreciate the questions. We'll be back in 2 weeks, which today's the 10th, so 2 weeks would be the 24th, if my math is right. So if that's 2 weeks from this Thursday, we'll be back with you again, same time on Ask the Agronomist, and appreciate your participation as always. Everybody take care.